Can you say a little bit about what inspired this movement? And in particular, I'm interested in the connections with New York, but also you talked about connections with London. So if you could say about this kind of international and globally connected dimension.
Yeah, um, I think the initial connections are in the imagination. There are very few. There are a number of important individuals who can make that journey to New York. But I think the impact of that television program that Sidney presented in 1984 and 1985 is that he is presenting a culture that makes sense to people in their own situation. So it's an identification rather than an actual physical connection. But they're seeing that it's a culture that speaks to their world. It speaks of their world. The fact that it is about speaking and is about expression directly, I think matters a lot. The translation thing is an interesting one. That obviously the initial versions of hip hop that arrive in France are all in English. They're all in the English language. At some point, there is this transition into a French language, a French idiom, and that's an interesting process. The way in which the rhythms of hip hop, the styles of hip hop, are incorporated into a model of French language, which is actually it fits into the everyday linguistic exchanges that young people find themselves in. So there are patterns of French slang which precede hip hop. So the so-called verlan, which is this kind of reversal, splitting words up and reversing them. That goes back at least 100 years, but it fits easily into the coded idioms of hip hop. So this idea that you can speak a language which you understand, your peers understand, but maybe the outsider doesn't get all the, so it becomes your own. So I think it's that sense of ownership that is really important, that matters in that translation from the Anglophone to the Francophone.
And can you give us a timeline for that process? So they're absorbing this culture which is in English. Was there any discussion, for example, about singing in English, or?
Well, pop culture in France has been beset by long debates about whether you should sing in English or in French, and there's been a view expressed about the inauthenticity of French pop culture, that somehow the French language doesn't translate very well to the musical forms of Anglophone rock music, and therefore some French rock musicians have argued that you sing in English because it's more true to the origins of rock and roll, for example, and that somehow to translate into French is inauthentic. And there were those discussions, there were those debates quite early on, but they often were judgments passed by outsiders. So the director of the Saint-Denis Jazz and Blues Festival, which is quite a prominent national and international jazz and blues festival, he described Supreme NTM as a caricature in 1989 or 1990, just before they made their national breakthrough. So his perception of them was just they were copying rather than producing a form.
Yeah, why did he say that?
I think, well, he uses the word in French, aping, and there is a potential. For someone who is a fan of jazz and blues, you would think that kind of language is rather on dodgy ground for me. That there is a kind of subtle racism because you're presenting them as monkeys who just copying without knowing what they're doing. So I think there is a kind of prejudice. It's also prejudices against commercial culture because it's seen as too commercial. So I think there are those prejudices. Interesting though, I think because the rap allows patterns of vocalization which are more about speaking than singing, I think quite quickly the capacity of the French language to be deployed in that context without all the hang-ups about is the euphony of the French language appropriate for the harshness of rock music? It doesn't matter. So, an artist like MC Solar embraces an identity and is then celebrated quite quickly as a kind of more poetic or intellectual form of rap, which sits well with traditions of French poetry and French musicality and so on. So I think that debate about inauthenticity is superseded pretty quickly. Really, by the late 80s, there is the acceptance that an independent, autonomous French form of hip hop, which expresses French realities, is a real thing.